Inspired by the recently published book, Housing and Politics in Urban India, Opportunities and Contentions by Sweta Raudananka, we initiated today's dialogue on housing justice in times of continued uncertainty. The intention of this roundtable today is to learn from each other and engage in North-South, South-North dialogue across geography and theoretical boundaries and disciplines, as well as across theory and praxis. We aim to identify common underpinnings of housing injustice and to highlight creative initiatives, movements, and government models that resist financialization of housing, to follow the motto of housing as a common instead of a commodity. My name is Tobias Beitsch, and I allow to introduce myself. I have the honor to moderate today's round table. I'm an architect by formation, and after some years in practice, I turned to academia and pursued a PhD revolving around informality housing and user-driven urbanization in India, Mumbai. I did so at the Urban Sociology Laboratory at EPFL Lausanne, and currently I'm a scientific collaborator at the BFH, the University of Applied Science Bern, where I teach and research in the architectural division. Just before we start in this, I give you a brief outline on the format and the proceeding of this roundtable. Of course, we will start first with the book that anchors our discussion. Sweta and myself will give short insights and background on her work. We then turn to the members of the panel, and allowing each one to give them a statement about their own perspective on housing justice, and hopefully to illuminate this with an example from his or her research and engagement. After a round of questions, reaction, discussion among the panel, we will open to the floor to the discussion to the public. A question may be asked in the chat or just open your mic. As a final note, we will record this roundtable. So if you don't want to be seen on screen, your face don't want to be published, just turn off your camera. Please keep off your microphone while you're not speaking. So that's the very first part. So allow me to introduce the author. Sweta Raudananka is a professor at the University of Applied Science and Arts of the Western Switzerland. She works at the School of Social Work Fribourg and is there since 2018. She holds a voluntary position as a representative of the International Federation of Social Workers to the United Nations Geneva. She teaches community approaches, international aspects of social work, critical social work, sustainable development, and articulation of the social and the spatial. Sweta's research interests revolve around urbanization and its social impacts, urban governance, and environmental justice. Last but not least, she's the author of our book, Housing and Politics in Urban India, Opportunities and Contention, which was published 2020 at the Cambridge University Press. Well, the driving question of her book is, why is there no sustained mobilization around housing in urban India when at the same time there's a huge housing shortage, particularly affecting economically weaker sections? While according to conventional social movement theories, all the elements for mobilization are present in the city of Bangalore, which is the focus of her work, there's still no sustained social movement claiming housing justice at the time of her research, which was and fieldwork, which was around 2707, if I'm remembering correctly. So there's not only a need to adapt the theory to a post-colonial context, but also to review the actual existing conditions. By actual existing conditions for that hinder social movement, Sweta is looking into at once on the legal and policy frameworks, and on the other hand, on the political and bureaucratic institutional conditions and the lived experience of slum dwellers and their voiced heroes. So focusing on Bangalore in South India, in her book, Sweta describes the impediments that there are to such mobilizing from a theoretical social movement perspective, and sheds light on community engagement and the tactical and strategies to bring about transformative change and claim adequate housing that resists co-opted forces and navigate the social political landscapes. So Sweta, we want to know, how did you come about to study this topic?
Yes, thank you so much for your introduction, Tobias. Thanks for the organizers to host this roundtable, and of course, all the panelists for accepting to contribute to this roundtable. So yes, I had inquisitiveness from the beginning about the nature of inequalities, living contrasting realities. So I used to spend summers in Bangalore, where I was born and my parents are from, but of course I was raised in Switzerland. So yes, so Bangalore is situated on the Deccan Plateau. It has a moderate climate, and it used to be quite an unpretentious city before it rose kind of to the world's back office and the software hub of the world. So it grew from the 70s to 2010 about fourfold, and it houses today almost 11 million people. So from a licensed Raj at the service of a planned economy to the post 1990s, where the markets were free, were liberated, you could see an incredible transformation of the cityscape. So you could see like dazzling offices of IBM, Microsoft, Indian software companies, malls mushrooming all over this space, and of course a lot of consumerist excitement as well. So we used to go there summer by summer every year, and every year I could really see a drastic transformation. And of course, as a growing up youth, I also saw that like all middle class, higher caste youth, they all went into being software engineers. They all bought a car, an apartment somewhere down the line in their professional life. So to me, like globalization was really very, very tangible. And but of course, still low income housing persisted, slums persisted. And of course, in Bangalore, there's no really huge, vast expanse of slums, but it exists. They exist in pockets of areas. So I really remember sitting in this rickshaw. I speak about it in the beginning of the book, on a road that was supposed to be widened. As there was so big increase of traffic, all the roads were supposed to be widened. And I remember really residential and commercial units being totally ripped off of their facades. So you could see into people's houses, people were still there with their stuff. And I saw this, women and families crouching on the floor and having this empty gaze on the road. So I really felt like with all this influx of capital and urbanization happening, how were they supposed to benefit from it? So they are the ones who service the entire city, but they're not really included in the benefits of rapid urbanization. And of course, from lay knowledge, I knew that India had an incredible action repertoire in terms of movement. We saw the independence movement, the environmental chipko movement, women's movement. And I really thought, like, how aren't we seeing this huge informal movements really to claim inadequate housing? I thought if people came together in the city of Bangalore, like millions could come together who are affected by the situation, the city would stand still. So when I had these intuitive questions, then I had this opportunity to do my PhD to explore these questions in a social movement perspective. And I learned that a sustained movement, had the ingredients of so-called WUNC, so worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. So my task was really also to test social movement theory that was mainly built on European and American case studies against post-colonial India. So Bangalore saw scattered, a sustained movement in the 80s, and otherwise rather scattered efforts. So my aim really became to understand the entanglements, the informal entanglements of networks of politics, the land mafia, also understanding housing policy and citizenship rights, to read really how community-based organization on one hand and international resource NGOs on the other hand mobilized to claim adequate housing against these networks and the policy framework existing.
Thank you for this, let's say, moving autobiographic moments in this work. I was wondering how from this very early start you kind of moved up the ladder to the question of housing justice in the end. It's also towards the end of your book, you come to this moment where it becomes more clear, and then the next question actually opens up, right?
Yes, so when we talk about housing justice, we of course seek normative concepts, frameworks for housing rights. They exist internationally and also at the local level. So of course, Article 25 in the Declaration of Human Rights, or Article 11 in the International Covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights, they both talk about adequate standards of living. And in India, it's interpreted under the fundamental right, Article 21. So, but of course, all of this is subject to legal interpretation, and that too in the context, of course, of other political and economical forces that shape urbanization and conditions for adequate housing. So in my PhD, and of course also in my postdoc research, the crux of the matter really became land, as you all know. So there can't be reasonable conditions for adequate housing and socially inclusive housing without addressing the question of land, but also urban citizenship. So I think the notion of urban citizenship, or the right to the city as framed by Henri Lefebvre and other scholars, hint towards that there is an exercise of claiming to ensure adequate housing and resist co-opted forces that nowadays especially are promoted, by financialization of land and the process of urbanization that is now highly exclusive in this neoliberal era, and which really unleashes mass dispossessions as cities expand and densify. So I really learned that, in fact, in a neoliberal era, the urban and industrial policies, they go hand in hand, and that cities really had to raise their own money if they wanted to build kind of world-class infrastructure, as many metropolises have the aim to be. And it was only possible with the assurance that land value will spike and a widespread dispossession will happen. Only under these conditions would large investors, corporations, but also development banks come and invest in urbanization in the global south. So I feel really that claiming housing, at least in such metropolis, is really a different business today. It's not only about mobilizing and going legal against the state or private landowners. It has become about resisting forces of financialization, and it's kind of an invisible ghost nowadays. These private equity investment societies and their capital. It's really invisible. It's become an invisible target. And you need an incredible amount of complex understanding of these processes at different scales, and also about the operation of such actors. And I think when we talk about housing justice, it's really in such context nowadays.
Thank you. I like this this moment when you, in the beginning of your book, it seems so obvious, the target. And can you dissect it on every end, being the fragmented states, also the segmented civil society, and also that when it really dissolves towards the end. But I guess we come later on to also that to a certain moment where there could be a way forward or a way hope. I would like to turn now to the panelists, and before we start, I make a short introduction of who is present. And we have the honor to welcome our first guest, Amita Bhavishkar. And as you have most certainly noticed, Amita is the keynote speaker at this Congress. So awaiting an elaborate introduction. This allows me to keep me very short here, also in the moment of time. Amita Bhavishkar is a professor of environmental studies and sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University and Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. Her research addresses the cultural politics of environmental and development in rural and urban India. Amita published widely and was awarded multiple prizes for her work. She is acclaimed for her contribution to the field of environmental sociology in India and to the study of social movements. The second panelist is Luca Patteroni. He holds a PhD in sociology from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Paris, and he is a maître d'enseignement et de recherche at the Laboratory of Urban Sociology at the EPFL, where he leads the research group City, Habitat, and Collective Action. He has been visiting professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and is visiting scholar at the University of Columbia. He is co-editor of the Swiss Journal of Sociology and president of the artist and artisan cooperative Ressources Urbaines. His work is concerned with expression of difference and the making of the common in contemporary city. And last but not least, Cyril Royer is an urban planner and architect. He is working for Coda Housing Cooperative in Geneva, which develops more than 1,000 sustainable corporate housing units as an alternative to housing speculation. He's also on the board of the Urbamonde NGO, facilitating cohabitat network, whose work is to connect community-led housing organizations around the world and strengthen their ability to produce housing as a common. For the last 10 years, he has worked on the development of the Senegalese Federation of Habitations, regrouping more than 50,000 women, building and renovating houses for slum dwellers in Dakar. So let me go back. Sorry. One more second. There we are. Would like to go in that order of presentation and ask first Amita to present her personal perspective on housing justice, and we'll listen to you. Please.
Thank you, Shweta, for your very provocative, stimulating book. Thank you, Toby, for setting up the frame for this discussion. I should note that most of my research on this topic has been done in Delhi, in India, and so I speak from that perspective of the Global South. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about, Shweta has referred to, but I might touch on them again. Let me begin by emphasizing the context in which we work and speak. In India, since the 1990s, that context has been that of policies of economic liberalization, by which I mean the pursuit of economic growth at all costs through partnership between the state and private capital. And in the case of cities, this has meant the development of real estate as commercial value. So this has meant that land that was the urban commons, riverbeds, lakes, derelict land along railway tracks or sewage canals has now been commodified. And from being the default, from default access to working populations, land has now become something which has been parceled off to the kinds of developments that Shweta referred to malls, to new kinds of expensive, capital-intensive urban infrastructure, stadiums, and so on. And in order to do this, what we've seen is a kind of urban enclosure movement, by which I mean that working class populations who lived on these lands or who used them have been evicted, often at very short notice, often brutally, bringing in police and bulldozers. And the scale of this eviction has been huge, even though it has barely been recognized. And the media will not report it. By and large, there's very little attention from the rest of the city. But we must remember that we're talking about Indian cities where often a quarter of the entire population, or in the case of Delhi, 60% of the urban population, happens to live in slums, by which I mean illegal settlements, or what are called unauthorized colonies, land where which has been occupied by people, even though it is against the land planning designations for a certain area. Let's also note that when we're talking about the Global South, we're talking about the utter failure of urban planning. In India, urban planning formally of cities as we inhabit them now started in the 1950s. And the ideal of spatial order based on the rational allocation of resources has from the beginning been a deeply conservative exercise. And it's systematically underestimated the extent of housing needed for working class populations. Take the great celebrated case of the city of Chandigarh, designed by the Swiss architect Le Corbusier, invited by India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru to build this greenfield site in North India into the ideal utopian modern Indian city. Le Corbusier's Chandigarh is brilliantly mapped out in terms of different zones and sectors and so on. But he forgot a key feature that for this city to work, it needs about 50% of its population to service it, the vegetable vendors, the people who will wash your clothes, collect your garbage, work in your homes to look after your children and clean your house. Le Corbusier made no provision for this, this intrinsic fact of the deeply unequal society, which is India, which is why the planned city of Chandigarh, like every Indian planned city, has an ugly twin, which is the slum which has come up, the series of slums which come up in pockets in order to provide services to the so-called planned sections of the city. Similarly, industrial estates across across India have plots of land for different kinds of factories and plants to be set up. They have no provision for workers' housing. So these are the kinds of examples that show how planned cities have neighborhoods and which are skewed towards the well-off sections of the population. And therefore, unsurprisingly, poor people have fended for themselves, made provisions for themselves by building modest houses, shanty towns, first made of temporary materials, then made of bricks and so on, wherever they can negotiate informal deals with political patrons. Often these have been places which are not only illegal, but they are built in the interstices of the planned economy, often on hazardous sites, as I said, the sides of riverbeds, which means they're liable to flood, lake beds, which means they get waterlogged. And of course, being illegal, they are perpetually denied of the amenities, sewage systems, water, healthcare, education, all of those things that well-off neighborhoods and well-off populations take for granted in the city. So the development of slums in the city, of substandard housing in the city, is not an accident. It's not an aberration from the planning process that, oh, we forgot this, let's set this right. It is something which is intrinsic to the way in which planning happens in the global south, the way in which it is centralized. And we must remember that the logic of planning as a top-down exercise is consistent with the fact that informal settlements and slums, in fact, speak to the dynamics of political economy in a deeply unequal society, by which I mean that the only way to have labor and services available cheaply in a country like India is by always keeping the people who provide these services and this labor in a state of insecurity. So insecurity of work, insecurity of shelter, it has in fact only increased with economic liberalization since the 1990s. Hence, the evictions that I spoke about have only increased. And therefore, what we need is not some sort of corrective to some universal notion of housing rights, but we need theory from the global south that recognizes that the nature of the southern city is different because of the high prevalence of informal illegal settlements. So informality cannot simply be folded into formal relations, but we must deal with the ways in which informality both is productive for poor people by allowing them a foothold in the city, but at the same time, it leaves them in a state of insecurity. How do we deal with that? So to address the questions that Tobias asked, I think to expect that the state will invest in social housing on a scale required is frankly unrealistic, given the political economy that I have outlined, where what Mike Davis calls a planet of slums is actually productive to the working of capital, to the working of political power. However, what has made a difference to the prospect of poor people gaining housing is the ideology of the government in power. When I look at Delhi, I see that particular moments in time when populist governments were, led the state, were moments of temporary reprieves in the late 1970s. And currently in Delhi, where we have the populist government of the Aam Aadmi Party, we see that there's been a halt on evictions and there's been some move towards in situ upgradation of the substandard housing in which people live. However, this goes so far and stops because people still do not have secure title to the lands that they have come to occupy by stealth. So collective mobilization, the question that this round panel asks us to consider, depends on several things. It depends on party ideologies, like I just said. It also depends on the legacies of collective action that particular cities embody. So in the case of Mumbai, a city with a long history of industrial action through the textile mills, people who live in slums have a very different set of experiences that help them come together, something that's not the case in Delhi, a city which has much more of a patronage element to its politics, being the national capital. But I want to point out that the possibilities for collective action are hampered by the state's politics of recognition, where the state rewards slum dwellers based on the length of their residence, how long they've been in a particular place, and whether they can produce documentary evidence, papers to show that they've been there. And when the state recognizes some people according to these criteria, it ends up disenfranchising a lot more people, recent migrants, for instance. So if you look at any slum, which is where evictions have taken place, you find less than 20% of people get title to a plot of land somewhere on the outskirts of the city where quote unquote resettlement is taking place. Even they suffer great hardship because they lose their access to work. But 80% of people who are renting in the slum or who can't summon the paperwork, they just disappear because they have no chance of getting anything from the state. So, collective action in this case, which is impossible because it divides up people of owners who are long-standing from everyone else. And the long-standing owners who have the most political capital are those who are least likely to oppose eviction, because to do so would mean jeopardizing their chance of getting that resettlement plot on the outskirts of the city. So the conditions for collective action become difficult because of these politics of recognition. Finally, I want to say that collective action is also hamstrung by the hegemonic discourse of liberalization, with its dreams of India as a world superpower and the idea that Indian metros will become so-called world-class cities. This is a fantasy in which certain domestic political parties, courts, the Supreme Court, the High Court, the Indian media, as well as elite populations, collaborate. In my own work, I've called this desire for the world-class clean green city, bourgeois environmentalism. In his work on Delhi, Asher Gertner calls this rule by aesthetics. This is the idea that the poor should provide labor in the city, cheap labor, but they should be invisible. And this exclusionary apartheid idea of the city is extremely hard to dismantle. But dismantling this discourse is actually crucial if we are to try and secure housing in the forms in which people want it, in ways that best suit their work habits, their social networks, etc. Where is this dismantling going to come from? I think the present moment of uncertainty shows that there are actually all kinds of unintended consequences which we cannot anticipate. And from that moment of great turbulence, I'm ending. Yeah, okay. That's my final sentence. And from that moment of turbulence, we can look at at new ways of subverting what are extremely powerful systems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amita, for this overview on and insights in the Delhi particularly, and the Indian situation on where collective action manifestation can come from and might be hindered. It's some of it really remembers me of what Sweta has been written, and some of it, particularly the division between the different groups of target groups of politics, or or not, or the exclusion through allocation, for example, of housing, might very much speak also to Luca Patteroni's intervention. I was wondering, and just to give you one question back, you had spoken of this, the experience, the legacy of social movements. Can you give an example from Delhi, or can you elaborate on that? Having worked on Mumbai, this was particularly around the new master plan, the Mumbai development plan. There was a huge movement that in the end was kind of turned down, but that what was keep carrying on was that they have been working together again, and kind of this memory was become very strong. Is there some similar thing around housing happening or happened in the past for Delhi?
I think there've been very, very patchy affairs in Delhi, because, as I said, since it is a national capital, there is much more surveillance from the top, and therefore and Delhi doesn't have a history as an industrial city. Most of the population of Delhi increased at the time of independence around 1947, when a lot of refugees came into Delhi from the partition of India and to what is now Pakistan and so on. And these were mainly trading classes. So given that kind of history exists in Delhi, when I think of what are moments where a history of organization has served people well, I think of particular a small union called the Construction Workers Union, the Nirman Mazdoor Panchayat Samagam, which, when its members were being evicted from a particular slum settlement, because they had been used to working as a union, they were able to collectively work with the landowning authority, the Delhi Development Authority, in order to make sure that people weren't left out from the survey that was done in order to see who was eligible for housing and so on. Mind you, the important caveat here is that by and large, these were all slum dwellers who had been in the area long enough, who'd been in Delhi long enough, and who had that experience of organizing. And they didn't necessarily speak up for their tenants or for more recent migrants. But when I look at and the fact is they were evicted, but what they did manage to ensure was that when they got plots of land 40 kilometers away on a resettlement site, they made sure that they got them all together. They made sure that they worked together to get amenities there and so on. So that's a quote unquote, success story. One little point of light in what is otherwise a very, very bleak outlook.
Thank you, Amita. Given the time, we have to move on to the next one. We'll certainly come back. And Luca, I think the floor is yours. There will be certainly some speaking to each other coming up. I see it coming.
I will share my screen. I have a small presentation. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's as you will see, it's really close in a certain way. It mirrors what has just been presented by Amita Bhavishkar, and but I will be talking from the Global North, and I made a presentation here, and I mentioned two of my colleagues because we are working on those topics right now in a FNS project on precarious migrants, and so we are trying to address the question of subaltern housing policies. in order to explain what I mean by diffuse slums and subaltern housing policies, I will just come back to Geneva's history. And I'm not used to it. It is key. I have to find a way to, okay. I don't know, I did that. So what happened in after the Second World War in Geneva, in Switzerland, in general, they tried to have migration within a legal frame, a poor legal frame, because it was only men allowed to come to Switzerland for 9 months. They were called seasonal workers. They were not allowed to have their wife and children, and they used to come also illegally. And those workers, they came in order to participate to the need to build housing. And a striking images for us, and it really talks about what Amita just explained to us. It's those people coming from from Italy or from Spanish. They were living in barrackments. So they were subaltern workers, and they were building up the social housing projects. And so you can see in the back the social housing projects, and in front the barrackments of the subaltern workers. And of course that remind us of the situation of contemporary workers in Dubai living in barrackments, and in the fact that there's always a strong hiatus. I will come back to that, between social policies aimed at the people who are belonging to the country. We have entitlement for the rights and for social rights, and those the newcomers who are not able to are not entitled for those social rights. And so what happened? I put a small image of a barrackment in Dubai, contemporary barrackment. And so what happened I won't go in detail because we don't have time for that, but there were been social mobilization around that because soon the barrackments were not enough. And so there was lots of seasonal workers who were homeless. They had to live also within the places where they were building the new buildings. And they were also hosted by the Salvation Army, and they soon started to claim for a better housing and for better management of their rights, for better, more decent treatment. And so they come up with mobilization, and so the answer was to try to improve that. There's a bunch of associations that built up, and they worked on the living conditions. And so the answer was that the people would come to Switzerland only if they have suitable accommodation. So they did not remove for a long time the status of those seasonal worker, but they were claiming that they would have to be hosted in a decent way, and was also something that was a responsibility of the employer. And it was for us interesting because it's the starting of what we could call an hospitality policy, which is we make a difference between integration policies, which are based after the people have been there for 10 years and they can have some entitlement. Hospitality policies are framing or looking at the condition of work, of condition of housing, condition of abusive exploitation, abusive loans. I come back to that. And so there were inspectors hired to look at the decency of those of the housing of those seasonal workers. There's a setting of some part of the bureaucracy working for that part of the people, that part who don't belong to the social democrat social system. I'll come back to the social democrat social system because I think it's an important point of distinction I do with what Amita has been showing us before. And finally, they were building up some buildings that in the end, by the beginning of the 2000s, the status was abrogated because it was not complying with migration international policies, and Switzerland had to stop employing people for 9 months, negating them the right to be with their family. And the interesting thing, and it's where I will take three, 4 more minutes to explain. My point starts from here. And what have those seasonal workers become? They did not disappear, of course, because there's this structural problem of, and it's a structural problem which is not only linked with to the fact that capitalist societies have been bad to employees and they want to have poor people working, which is true. And it's profitable, and it's something which Amita has been describing really well. But we have to remember that in the 19th century, the first passports, they were delivered by in France in relation with the building up of the social democratic system, the socialist system. At the moment where you start to say, okay, who is entitled to receive something from the states, then you start to divide. And so the huge question is until where you can allow people to benefit from the state redistribution. And it's a strong structural program, which is not only linked with capitalist malevolence, which is also a great thing and very present. It's also an internal problem of social democratic problem countries. I come back to that briefly at the end. And so we have now, since the beginning of the 2000s and more recently, even more, we have low-wage workers, undocumented, we have homeless people, we have asylum seekers, and they all belong to, they will all at one point belong to the subaltern population. And so I won't stop on too much on that, but where do they live now? And some of the previous buildings that were made for seasonal workers now are working for refugees. And so there's this transformation of the barrackments into places for contemporary undocumented workers or legal asylum seeker. But also, they also benefit from different crises. There's a whole emergency situation. And that's the reason we're starting to talk about diffuse slum. Is the fact that the subaltern workers that are like within slums in southern, in the global south, they are partly invisible. You know, when they were seasonal workers, they were visible. There were strong fights around that, and now they are partly invisible. They are also hosted in churches, which are temporary, transformed into places to live, or they are hosted in nuclear bunkers, which are open for a while. And there are fights against each of those solutions, but they're also sleeping in the street, and they're also, and a lot of them, and that's what's something which is really important in global and southern cities. It's the abusive landlords. There's lots of renting in Geneva. It's 85% of the people are renting house, and it's illegal to rent. And so there's a question that a lot of them are living in abusive situation, and so it makes it difficult to have sorry, I don't see my own, I have to move my, sorry, I have a problem with my, okay, I will try to, okay, perfect, sorry. So I come to my two last slides. I take 2 minutes, Tobias, if I may. Okay, and so subaltern housing policy, as I say, which is a problem of the north and the south. It's a problem of the fact that we have always newcomers, and it's difficult to give them a room, or it's and lots of people will also benefit for the fact that they don't get a room because there's exploitative elements here, and so there's this persistent hiatus between newcomers and integrated inhabitants, for capitalist reasons, but also for socialist reasons. And so their housing is, when it's managed by the state in global north, it's managed as emergency policy, and it's mostly also invisibilized. So there's these diffuse slums of the global north, which, because they have no clear territory, it's no clear political object. Why is it there isn't a clear political object? And as I tried to say, it's a sectorialization and multiplication of the actors involved, because there are lots of increased blood situation, because it's not only asylum seeker or migrants that come to live for all their life in Switzerland. There are lots of what we call a circular migration, people that go out, come back, and it's so the movement is much complex, and we have more and more population, and this will increase. And that's the reason I wanted to talk on that topic, because in the next 20 years, 30 years, the ratio between what the social system is capable to absorb and the large increase of these blurred mobilities with also expatriates, with also cross-border workers will become a huge problem, questioning more deeply what the social welfare or what any welfare system can be. And so it's, for the moment, it's different areas of the welfare system. There's policies of homelessness, policies of asylum. What we realize that policies of homelessness are policies of migration, but there's lots of people and communes and state agencies who don't want to say, okay, we want to treat homelessness, but the problem is homelessness are migrants. And so there's lots of unspoken discussion around that, and lots also of xenophobia, and that's a complex problem. And the mobilization is also sectorial. There's a helping association to help legal refugees, then association fighting for homelessness, association fighting for unlimited workers, and sometimes they fight together, but more often they fight against each other, because they say, okay, this problem is more visible, and so on, and they fight abusive loans, abusive housing condition, abusive legal frameworks, and it's really difficult to build something together. And my last, sorry, I have a problem with my I have a last. Okay, and my last point will be: we are living in saturated cities in global north and also in global south, but it's land pressure, it was already evocated, and also regulatory pressures with an expansion of the bureaucratic social welfare, and with question who are the legitimate inhabitants, and how do we overcome the shortcomings of status-based social housing policies. And we will see now after that we can make cooperative, but cooperatives housing, it's a legal housing, they cannot host people who are not with a legal status. And so will cooperative become host illegally people? Or we used to have squats in Switzerland, and squats were interesting because they were outside of the legal system. It was a more informal system. And but I believe that any social housing system will be exclusive and won't be able to address the problem I'm tackling here. And any decommodification system has that risk too, also, because if you decommodify through the states, then you start having the legal question. I don't know how it happens with slums rehabilitation in India, and at what point the question of is the people entitled? Is it someone from India or someone from outside? I don't know if it's a question, but it's a huge question in Europe. And so, do we need to informalize global north cities, or do we need to call for the hospitality role of the rent market? That's a very tricky question, because actually there's lots of people working to make the market more right, and also to fight abusive renting condition, but allowing renting condition, because there are lots of sub-renting is also the way that the cousins and the grandparents and the friends come from South of Africa or some South America. And so there is it's a tricky question about is it will be led by state, or does the market as an interesting or not dimension, as it is also for slums, where the people start to be their own real estate, when they increase of one floor, as in Tobias Beach PhD, and you build one floor, and then you start renting your own floor, opening it up to poor people from your own village. The exploitative question is central, but that could be also dealt by specific association fighting for renters' rights. And and then there will be the building up of new collective mobilization. That's another question. I stop here because I talked too long. Sorry about that, but maybe in my hope, I don't know if I have any hope, but statement, I will come back to that collective mobilization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luca, for your presentation. I think it really has there's some commonality around the fragmented civil society that really speaks to each other. I was rather above or beyond this similarity. I was kind of I stumbled upon these emergency policies in European North European context, where there seems to be a need for action and a certain momentum and reaction by the state, by the municipality, city, whoever, like the authorities. Listening to Amita, this seems not so much the case in Indian city when there is demolition happening under the radar of whatever newspaper or public view. It seems that it's just kind of protracted. Even though if it's not the best thing that this emergency usually produces, it nevertheless seems to me an action that might give some seeds for future development or future social movement or social mobility. Given the time, I would rather like to move on to Cyril, because he might be able to bridge the North-South gap, having worked on both ends of the spectrum very much. And let's see where we move on from here. We come certainly back for a round of discussion. And thank you.
Thank you, Tobias. You give me a big responsibility, bridging the North-South gap. So I'm not sure I will hold to that. But nonetheless, I'll try to bring points from both my experience working here in Geneva, in Switzerland, with housing cooperatives, and also in the South context. So both in Senegal and maybe larger point of view with the cohabitat network perspective. So I would like to start with a fact that was published a few years ago by State of Geneva. It was that housing cooperatives for the same size of housing costs 52% less than the market. So if you do the calculation, it means that every month there is around 200 million Swiss francs that goes into the pockets of a few people, and that these 200 million Swiss francs per month are not linked to the work of construction, the work of architecture, nor the work of, let's say, the banks, or the promotional work as developers. So these 200 million per month, which is a huge sum to spend, I'd like to try that one day. It's one example in one city, but you could just spread the calculation worldwide. What does it mean in terms of economical power and pouvoir d'achat? And working every day as, let's say, alternative developer here in the city of Geneva made me realize that, yes, for most of the people who work in this field, city is a financial product. It is not for the people, it is not people-centered. It is a financial product that is based on one rule, which is like the 4 to 5% margin that they require as a pension fund or as a developer. And I try to understand this perspective. As a pension fund, you want to have a return on investment, and you develop your project based on this logic. But basically, this logic excludes people, because it is just a financial product. So they they thought their work is centered as how to generate this margin. And I think that's what we try to do is to find an alternative to that and find a way to build city by and for the people. But when you say that, when you say you want city as a common or as a right, everybody is agree. But how can you make that? Okay, and I see two ways. The first is legal regulation. How can you regulate people that build city as a financial product? That's one way. It has its needs, but also its limitation. And the other strategy is to develop an alternative, and that's the alternative strategy I've chosen to dedicate most of my work. And basically, it says that, okay, if it costs 50% less to build a city that is made by the people, why should that be just a margin, you know, by the game of their own sets of capitalism rule? If it costs twice less for the same quality, then it should somehow replace these speculative products. And the added point to that alternative is that it's not just for the same quality, it's that housing cooperatives or the alternative bring much more than just cutting down the cost by a factor 2. It brings social cohesion, it brings community, it brings new type of spaces, it brings common rooms, it brings solidarity between people, and it brings much more ecological solutions, so for the sustainable city. So the vision is to replace somehow the investor-led city by some form of community-led city. But this initiative is more or less at the middle ground between two extremes. Of course, there is the investor-led city, which has planning, which has quality sometimes not, but definitely has no people or no community. On the other end, you have the squatter city, which have people, lots of people sometimes, lots of community and cohesion, but most of the time no planning, and sometimes quality can be discussed because it is precarious most of the time, but sometimes it's more adequate than we might think, and sometimes it's much more adequate than the investor-led city. So we can have a debate on the quality from this point. But there is a space in the middle between the squatter city and the investor-led city, which I would call the community-led city. That people as a group, as both the investor, the planner, and the user. In traditional urban planning, you have this role very separated. Okay, you have the user, which at the end, and sometimes not at all. You have the planner, which is somewhere very much in the beginning, and the investor, who is in the middle and decides most of the thing. And in the community-led approach, you have both investor, planner, and user roles together as the community. And it is a common, so it is not the state, it is not the market, it is a community. And this community, we try to create planning. So planning, sometimes we call participatory planning, but it's not really that. Okay, participatory planning is how people participate in the public planning. Here, the discussion is more about how do we build the city, starting from the most private thing to the most shared thing. So starting from your room, going to your building, going to your neighborhood, then going to the city. So how you can do that bottom up. And then planning is about public partnership. So the discussion is how can we implement a form of partnership where people as a community have a voice in the public planning and have a role in defining what the city is for tomorrow. Then the second level is, of course, connected to the discussion about public partnership, is about finance. If you want to have planning, then you have to have a mean to plan and project in the future. And without, some form of finance tool, then planning is very difficult for this community. So these brings me to two larger discussion that we will not have the time to elaborate here, but which is discussed in the book we've published on social production of habitat, which is public-people partnership in the form of tools that can allow for a production of the city that is community-led. The first is land and land acquisition, and we've seen many good examples where you can develop public policies where state actively builds a land bank or extract or protect land from the private market. We have good example here in Switzerland with a land bank who buys for a few $100 million per year from the market to give it back to the community. So it's enclosure the way around, okay? And then there is a very good example in Uruguay with the housing cooperative movement, and around the world we have lots of good examples of public policy ability to extract land from speculation. And the second tool, it is the caution guarantee, the public guarantee to the people. I think that there is an intermediary between the discussion of a group of people and the people that understand financial tools. And the intermediary is the public guarantee. So that's how the housing cooperative were able to grow here in Switzerland, is because of this tool that the states gives 80% guarantee to every loan that is made through a housing cooperative of a group of people. And then there is these tools about finance, which is the alternative strategy, because most of the slum dwellers, most of the people who want an alternative to the investor-led city need some kind of tool to develop. And a very good example is the peer-to-peer fund that was developed by the housing cooperatives 30 years ago, and say, yes, we can have a tool that allow the cooperative housing as a movement, as a growing movement to develop and help each other cooperation between cooperatives. And this fund allows to have more established cooperative create loans for growing cooperatives. So these are the tool sets that can be used to develop this people-led city alternative. And I think in the long term, the vision is really that if you want to implement city buy-in for the people, city as a common, the vision could simply be to retire these speculative investors. They are just producing something that is belonging to the past, which is twice as expensive and has lower quality. So there is no logic in the very long term, and I speak generation, that these people continue to do these kind of job, because there is an alternative and it costs much lower and it's much better quality. So I think that the wish is that we can find some law, and Zurich just voted one a few years ago, and Geneva is voting one right now, or building an initiative for that right now, which is to have a percentage of alternative community-led solution defined by law. And Zurich just voted 30% of that, which is a really nice target. Geneva has so much, that's a plus modéré, voilà, target. And yes, that's the wish, is that these community-led alternative help each other worldwide as a network, create a financial tool to help each other, that peer-to-peer fund we try to develop with Cohabitat, and that these community-led movement locally develop partnership with municipal or national partners, authorities, so that both land acquisition and public guarantee are offered in order to develop new policy. And I think these policy can complement, of course, the legal regulation that is needed, but that legal regulation is not enough, that we really need another form of production of the city, and it is as a common. That's it.
Thank you, Cyril, for your insights in this kind of tools. As summarizing, they have to remain at this moment. But I was really wondering, as you have also mentioned your work in Senegal, for example, to what extent these tools or this knowledge about tools can be transferred north-south, maybe also south-north, as
yeah, as a concrete example, so we've created the first peer-to-peer loans between Swiss housing cooperatives and slum dwellers in Senegal. So that's a first test to have loans between housing co-ops and slum dwellers. I think they belong to the same movement and should help each other. And then the second part is that we've currently trying to leverage the first public guarantee to a collective loan for these people to build a sustainable neighborhood. So slum dwellers buying together a piece of land and planning together a new neighborhood and creating a community land trust, that's more or less the legal form of it, to build a sustainable neighborhood. So let's say that the public guarantee of the state of Senegal towards the bank here is a very good leverage. So these are the two set of tools, we've just discussed. So this is a good example, I'd say, where we can try these, but there are also very good relevant examples in Latin America or Asia about it. So we could speak about.
Thank you so much. I think what you're describing or what you're engaging in is what your previous two speakers have kind of lamented that it's missing. It's the common experience around housing and the way out or a way forward. And maybe that's what you do at a very engaged local, like individual way. Maybe Sweta, you can also end this first round, and we are obviously very behind schedule, but nevertheless, I would love to give you the word. Maybe you can also then point towards the end of your book where you also have an opening.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm like enthused by all of your inputs, and hearing everybody. I actually want to change a little bit what I had prepared. The example you asked us to prepare. Nevertheless, I would like to show a few pictures. Can you see it? No. Yeah. Here.
Perfect.
Let me see it.
Yes. So this is an example from the book, and it struck me what Cyril says about investor-led and community planning. So in India, typically here you have, generally in the north, we have this process where land is planned for, and then you build, and then you occupy. So as in many places in the global south, and particularly in this case as well, you have communities that occupy land first, then build, and maybe then it's planned, where amenities, as Amita said, will come forward. And in my research that I present in the book, I really seek to see how differently resourced organizations actually engage in claiming. And one of the examples that were quite telling is the community-based organizations. They were basically two that are sitting around me on the right picture that kind of were a bit coached by a sociology professors and said, their motto was basically to say, development has to be on your terms. There are so many people talking about development, housing development, all that, but it has to be on your terms. And what they engaged in is really in terms of how to build conditions for participatory planning. So they engaged with communities on and on and on to change their perception, basically from slum dwellers, low caste slum dwellers, that they have to really endure these difficulties because of the position they're born from, to a self-perception of being citizen of the country and citizen of the city. So that really led to imbibing in these communities from within their same community. So they had the same language that they were speaking and the same metaphors they could speak with, basically telling them, you're not pigs to be living in these conditions. You're citizens of these countries, and there are some fundamental rights from the constitution. So they really imbibed social skill, but also procedural knowledge and tactical knowledge of how to engage with claiming. So when I heard you, Luca, and the mobilizations from the saisonnier here in Switzerland, so before they could mobilize, then in the 70s, and you said it happened really in the 70s, there was all this time where they actually had to understand how to probably engage with the Swiss state. So they really imbibed these three things. So what I call social skills, procedural knowledge, so knowing how to engage, how to know the policy, where there are the avenues for participation, and also tactical knowledge in what type of situation, with what kind of alliances, and especially against high pressures of informal repressions, because here they're squatting land. Land, of course, unleashes value. There are politicians, there's the land mafia behind that wants to keep it, and to actually get social housing on their terms, because here they were not yet living five years as the politics of recognition that Amita said. It was not in those terms. They were basically kind of thrown around the city in the peripheries, and each time they were kicked out from the rural people, saying we don't want any urban slum dwellers here around, until they engaged in almost a 15-year fight to finally have their land declared and housed. So this was then under a certain policy where they were housed. On the left, you see only one storage building. So this is very important, because then incremental building can happen. And the rest of the non-mobilizing slum communities, not the rest, but part of them in the city of Bangalore, they were housed at the periphery, and you see it's kind of beyond a ditch. So there is really a territorial obstacle to the city. And there was competition, of course, to who will get it. These are squatters in front of those matchboxes they used to call to get in. And this is then almost 10 years later against the same place, these buildings at the periphery. And as you see, the ditch here, which was just a feature of the territory, had even become a wall. So even if we talk about rehabilitation and inclusion in terms of social housing, it is still not being included in the city. So this then kind of also questioned me, like, if we want people to participate, if we want to promote participatory planning or more community-led planning, how can people with different bases of knowledge, with different backgrounds, with different self-esteem and community self-esteem, especially when you intersect with the notion of caste and class, how do you bring them to have enough confidence to really participate? And I think that is a major crux when you're trying to mobilize communities. It's resource intensive to participate and co-decide and really have equitable conditions and knowledge and skills to do that. So some of the insights then led us, in partnership with an NGO called Environment Support Group in India, to create how to do it workshops. So this was a moment where the master planning of Bengaluru had an opening of 60 days, where the public could give in their comments, send in their comments in appreciation of the new master plan, which was a highly technical and outsourced exercise. And so we kind of engaged with people interested. Of course, they were mainly urban and middle-class citizens, to explain them what it entails, that consultation process, how to comment on it, what are the stakes, what one should be looking at in terms of, as Amita also said, this allocation of spaces to certain instrumental functions. then to really contribute to having conditions that to participate. Another very interesting feature that I heard from Cyril was the way Switzerland, and you mentioned also Uruguay, is creating these land banks by taking land out of speculative markets. So in my research after this one, in India, we witnessed really how the inverse, how basically the commons land, grazing land, especially in rural areas, is taken out in the conjuncture also of industrial policy, is taken out to be given to speculation. So again, it comes back to this financialization pressures on how to resist and how to mainly promote what Cyril you're suggesting of creating community land banks. And I think this financial calculation of that it costs less, I really hope that this will carry on longer and builds its own legacy, because as soon as you put numbers, I think it also may talk to policymakers. Who knows? I will just end here so we have more time also to interact a moment.
Thank you, Sveta, for just insight in your research, and also maybe some hints at what to do. And I would love, given the time it's very short and it's getting very interesting now to talk to each other. I would love to make a very short round on the actors, on the allies of the possible positive allies. State obviously certainly is one, but sometimes it's not. This is probably the most tricky one, but maybe there is one. And Sveta, you hinted at that's probably the researcher, that's academia. What role could we play, or should we play, to foster a city as a common? Maybe make a very short round, and before we may open also the field, the discussion to our guests, our listeners, our public. Amita, what could be our role as researchers, as academics?
If I were to put it, 2 sentences, or rather 2 points. One, if I were to put it in a very sort of fancy way, I'd say our role is to speak truth to power. But I think this is a way of giving ourselves too much importance. Do is learn from those who we think we need to teach and educate, because often they have the best understanding of what is going on. Often what they lack is not knowledge, but the power to come together, a power that has been, in fact, taken away from them in the last, I believe it has become much worse in terms of these inequalities in the last 30 years. We can be public intellectuals, by which I mean write for newspapers, wherever possible, publicize as much as possible the predicament of the working classes. Challenge. The thing is that often planners and the government, they invite academics for consultations. Mm-hmm. In my experience, it's a form of co-option, frankly, because you spend all your time, saying, oh, but you need to improve your master plan to this extent. And then you find that the biggest violators of the master plan is the government. So rather than spend my time in meetings, conferences organized by big NGOs and the World Bank, by the Indian government saying, this is how we should make nice plans, I would rather be helping poor people in whatever way I can, writing about their predicament, helping them fight through, putting together documents for court cases, helping organizations in whatever way I can. That is the small role that I think academics can play in a situation which is as deeply unequal as the global South, where as academics we think we're experts and we're specialists and that we have the answers. The point is we don't have the answers, and we're not the ones best situated to come up with the answers because we don't have that everyday sense of urgency or the experience.
Thank you for your wholehearted response, Luca.
It's a tough question. I believe that we, as researchers, we have a role also of bringing concern and worries. I strongly believe we are more and more developing a sociology of ambivalences or ambiguities. There's a cooperative can be a powerful tool, but it can also bring new forms of exclusion. And so we really have to understand the moment where any of our project or any of our policy can be entrapped into neoliberal policies or capitalist production, or as an emancipatory power. And so we have to document, to go along. In Switzerland, there's lots of concern now about developing a circular economy, the cooperatives and stuff like that. And so we have to fight against, fight with those movements, but in the same time to bring within it touches of uncertainty, of ambiguities. It's the reason I was bringing back the question of the market, or I was also symmetrizing we have to fight against financialization, but we also have to fight against some forms of statification in a certain way. We can come back to that. I would love to do that, but I think it's really we really have a role along with our friend in the field to work on ambiguities. Yeah.
Cyril Modo, more activist and academic.
Yeah.
What would you wish from us?
I think, like, from my point of view, what is needed is more evidence on the alternative. As you know, science creates knowledge, creates doubts, but sometimes when you need to forge a policy, you need just evidence of if I take a risk to go this direction, then what are the evidence that can, support this change? And for that, science is useful in creating, arguments. My basic number as 52% is, a very useful tool that is produced through a study. And I think that documenting examples, documenting alternatives, is a very useful tool, that can be a partnership between, these activist movements and, academy and, researcher. But I think that too much time we see, this academic production which are creating debates for but just is some useful tools that are, somehow. I'm sorry, it was cut. Did you hear me?
Shortly.
Yeah, there was shortly a cut, but no,
Okay.
we got
So I was just standing and saying, useful arguments, useful evidence of alternatives around the world. It's a huge documentation project. I think Cohabitat network is trying to contribute to that as connecting communities and researcher in order to document all these alternative examples around the world. It's not just cooperatives, it's community land trust, it's slum dwellers movement, and all these people that are producing alternative. And I think that worldwide it can be recognized that there is probably as much of these production as there is investor-led city. So I think documentation is needed. That's it.
Thank you. Sveta, I guess the last word is yours, as time is running out.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add after all these great ideas. I end my book a little bit on this notion of, how to engage a little bit in a critical urban pedagogy. I think we have the power the infrastructure to bring together these communities who know very well and who know the pressures of everyday life. As Amita said, very, very simply, it could just open up our universities on evenings and weekends for people to come together, and then maybe engage conversations with people who do understand these complex financial mechanisms, to lay them bare, to say what are alternatives. And I think with our physical infrastructure at universities, with the really how to support learning communities to bring their own struggle forward and to give them visibility through documentation. I think as universities, we should be at the service of more inclusive cities. Short one.
Short one. Thank you. Well, nevertheless, question to the public. Do we have any questions? In the chat, there is none. So if you want to know anything any more closer from any of the examples of our panelists, please open your mic. Otherwise, if there would be a physical meeting, I would make you to sit and talk much more, but digitally allows to just turn off. That's the downside for it. Otherwise, we have to keep our time much better. I want to thank everybody of you all for this panel. It was very exciting. It opened up doors while also enlightening insights into fields and histories I haven't heard of before. We will have after that a informal exchange among us for a short round. But for that, I would close for this official version and yeah, clap hands if that is possible at this time, and wish you a good afternoon and continuing session at the Congress. See you soon.
Thank you, Tobias, for your excellent moderation, your ear for detail, and yes, your eye for linking things and bringing us together. Thank you so much, Tobias.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tobias. Yeah.
Thank you so much.